Brittany, I just want to give you a quick shout out. That was a great intro. I always get tripped up when I'm reading Kai's certifications too. Seems never ending. But today's presentation is going to be on the risks associated with methamphetamine and fentanyl. So it's a relatively new upcoming trend. I'm sure you've heard about it in the news. It's been going around for a little bit. It's still being studied and understood in this day. So it's a very interesting subject. We hope you guys take a lot from it. And we want this to be kind of an open discussion type presentation. So we'll kind of get into the subject matter a little bit, but please, if you guys have questions, write them down. We'd love to kind of have an open conversation towards the end of it. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Alex, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so the question is, what makes meth and fentanyl high risk? So in our field in EHS, we define risk, and likely in your field as well, as the frequency of an event and the severity of said event. So these are two kind of lenses to look through risk at. When you put them together, you get a good perspective on it. So on this slide, we've put together some probing questions, some things to kind of get our minds thinking about risk and meth and fent. So looking at the frequency side of the table, some questions we've put up are, what are the ongoing trends with meth and fentanyl? How often is it used, smoked in public, stored, consumed, right? How often is it being manufactured in a laboratory setting? Now in the severity lens, we can ask some questions that can get us thinking about how severe some consequences can be. Example are, what happens if new occupants, like the elderly, babies, families, if they're exposed in a contaminated environment? What happens to a property manager, contractor, or the general public when they're exposed in said environment? Who's on the hook for not assessing or appropriately remediating a contaminated environment? What are the associated costs? Things like litigation. How expensive is a typical meth lab remediation? And how expensive is typical meth use remediation? So we'll give a very brief intro to what methamphetamine and fentanyl is. I think most of us know, but I just want to touch on it a little bit to kind of familiarize ourselves. So meth is a drug that's used, it creates a pleasurable sense of well-being or euphoria, increased wakefulness and physical activity, gets people up and going. It's discovered in powdered, pill, or crystal form. Now for fentanyl, it has similar effects, but it's more of an opioid. So it makes people feel like euphoria is the best way to put it. Cause relaxation, pain relief, extreme happiness. It's also found in powdered or pill form. So like I mentioned, most of us probably understand the basics of these drugs, but what are some key takeaways? The first being that both substances have a very high potential for widespread misuse and addiction. And we find that fentanyl is commonly mixed with methamphetamine. We do a lot of surface sampling as part of our projects, and more often than not, when we analyze a sample for meth, we also tack on fentanyl, and we find that it's been cut into the methamphetamine. So why is that done? Oftentimes, fentanyl is relatively cheap and has a high impact. So when someone smokes it, they get a very strong effect. So given that background, it's being mixed in not just fentanyl, but a lot of other different drugs. Excuse me, I meant methamphetamine. So we have a background on the drugs. Now, how are we exposed to them in the day-to-day environments, and who suffers these consequences? A key thing to know is that when someone smokes methamphetamine or fentanyl in an environment, those vapors and residues condense and collect on surfaces. So things like ceilings, walls, counter spaces, high touch surfaces, like floors, doorknobs, anything you can think of. If someone's smoking in a room, the potential for those residues can be anywhere. And by that logic, anybody could be exposed. Whether working staff is in that room, future or current occupants could be exposed, the general public, anybody within and around that environment can be exposed. Now, that's just for smoking sites where someone's smoking out of a pipe or something. Now, if we're talking about labs, it gets much more intricate, much more hazardous, because more often than not, for a lab, there's a bunch of different chemicals involved. And the recipes used in a lab are endless, the chemical combinations are endless, and the hazards grow as a result of it. So you have things like toxic gases, chemicals, metals, toxic metals, anything you can think of being cooked in ways that aren't fully understood by even the EPA and a lot of other agencies. People kind of get their hands on whatever they can, throw it together, and now you have really dangerous concoctions being made. Now, say that an area has been contaminated, how are we exposed as the public or anybody else? The primary exposure routes are inhalation, dermal or skin contact, and ingestion. If we were to walk into an environment and breathe contaminated air, that air is entering our lungs and potentially into the bloodstream and the rest of the body. Dermal skin contact is pretty straightforward. If there's a contaminated surface, somebody touched it. Now, ingestion is a very good example as well. We kind of showed a few pictures at the bottom. We have a picture of a toddler. If you think of kids and how they interact with their environment, let's say there's a contaminated apartment and a toddler moves in. They're touching the floor, they're touching their hands, they're very interactive, and that potential for ingestion goes up at least tenfold. It's a very high risk scenario. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we've kind of gotten into a little bit of the background now. So how do we identify an area that's suspect? It might not look as obvious. Sometimes it's very straightforward. Sometimes there's subtle cues that we have to pick up on. So we've put together some pictures of things to look out for in a meth and fent use area, things like smoking, any white residues on a countertop, foil, whether it's burnt or used to package drugs folded like in this picture here, any hypodermic needles, any kind of strange smells or odors, burnt spoons, pipes, burnt or not, and sometimes very obvious, like crystal methamphetamine, like in this picture. But the key thing to take away from this is that in theory, any environment could be used to smoke or use meth. And this is what makes controlling it a very challenging process. You have apartments and homes, commercial buildings, storage units, public transportation, public spaces, metro areas, so a lot of city hubs, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, we're seeing a lot of meth and fent use, and it's growing exponentially. And Roosevelt will be touching on that in a minute. But in the picture, the bottom left, we put a picture there showing a playground. About a few years ago, I did a project up in Washington State where we were called to an elementary school because there was suspicious activity the night before. And when we were looking at the property, specifically the playground like this, we were finding needles poking up from the ground within the wood chips. Now, what's the risk involved in that? How severe is it? If you can imagine kids playing during recess, one of them picks it up, plays with it, or falls on it and they get poked, they could contract a lifelong disease, HIV, things like that. So very, very high risk. And the consequences are immense, I would imagine. So now we're going to shift gears to look at labs a little bit. So meth smoking and use sites are one aspect of it. Here's where it gets fun, the labs. It's a very tricky thing to be able to identify. So some of the things are very similar, like in the last example. If you look at the picture here, we have a white residue on a counter. If you smell strange odors, that could be a tip. But then there's some things that are not as subtle. So in this example, we have a couple of fire extinguishers that have been sprayed out. What you find often in meth manufacturing is they use pressurized cylinders, like a fire extinguisher or a propane tank, add some chemicals to it, and cook it under pressure to produce their product. Another not so obvious example is in the bottom left picture, you have two consumer or commercial sized jugs of muriatic acid, which if you were to just Google that, it's a common pool cleaning chemical. But specific acids like this will tip us off that it's being used to make meth. Other examples are like the butane stove, little camping stove, like in that picture here. And sometimes it's really obvious, like this stove here. You've charred, everything is charred. You have broken glassware, like beakers, two butane burners in the back, and a little red spray on the back, suspect red phosphorus, another ingredient commonly used in meth manufacturing. So like the previous example of a use area, this could be done anywhere. A lab doesn't have to be some huge operation like you would see in Breaking Bad, some big example with sophisticated equipment and this and that. Sometimes it's literally just a small box with 2 chemical containers and a little burner, and that meets the regulatory requirement and can be called a lab. So to elaborate on that a little bit, in this example here, we've pulled from the standard California Health and Safety Code 25,400.11. They define it. Meth lab activity means that legal manufacturing or storage of methamphetamine. Now you can imagine that has a very broad definition. Illegal manufacturing could be anything, could be large scale, could be very small scale, or even storage. We're working on another new project now where they were doing distribution, where they had basically pounds and pounds of meth. But just the fact that it was stored there now has to meet all these hoops that we'll touch on in a minute. So in a nutshell, a lab can be easily defined by anything where there's little activity or storage. And it's very simple, easy to overlook. All right, one last thing I want to communicate, regardless of the suspected site, whether it's used for use, smoking, storage, lab activity, the area should be secured and nobody should attempt to enter the space unless it's an environmental specialist who's well-trained, experienced, has the credentials, the background to assess it safely so nobody else gets hurt. Okay, so I've went on and on about meth. I'm going to pass it to my colleague Roosevelt. He's going to kind of show us some of the trends we're seeing today and how explosive this growth is when it comes to meth and fent.
Thank you, Patrick, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. I am going to speak on some statistics that will basically summarize how we have arrived to this point with methamphetamine and fentanyl overdoses. So we're going to look at a couple of CDC graphs and statistics that give you an idea on where we are today. So the first graph here gives a representation of the last 20 years. And as you can see over to the right, the tail end, the yellow, which is the second from the top, and the top, which is gray, represent both fentanyl and methamphetamine. So we can see that right around the pandemic area time frame, roughly around 2020, there was definitely a vast change in the slope of the trajectory of overdoses. And we can see that that actually started to really rise right about 2015. So there was a time period between March 2020 and April 2021, where for the first time in history, overdoses exceeded over 100,000 within a 12-month rolling period. So that was very big as a telltale sign of where we're going with this epidemic and how important it is, and the fact that it's not going anywhere anytime soon, and that we want to try to put controls in place and identify the risk and the hazards associated with it, so that when we do run into these situations, we know how to handle those and we know the risk associated. Next slide. Okay, so again, another graph here that specifically shows a very sharp trajectory in fentanyl overdoses, roughly about 2015. As we mentioned before, that was when the rise started to initially happen, but all the while peaked, during the COVID pandemic. One thing to note is that the regions in which the overdoses started to accelerate were very interesting. For example, in the Midwest, there was about a 33% increase in overdoses versus the South, where there was about a 65% increase in overdoses. And according to the CDC, the West had almost 94% increase in overdoses related to opioid related drugs. So this problem isn't going anywhere. It's growing. It's going to be dependent on regulatory standards and regulations state to state. The state of the state of Oregon, has very lax rules on drug use. And so, the hurdles that they face when it comes to contamination and cleanup and usage and things like that are going to vary vastly from, let's just say, California. So a lot of data here to digest, but as you can see, fentanyl overdose rates increased over 1,000%, over 1,100% actually from 2012 to 2018. And another fun fact to take away is that over 6 million lethal doses were confiscated by the DEA over 2 years. So one big problem with these overdoses is that there's little regard as to the doses of fentanyl and methamphetamine that are either being laced with other drugs or given in their pure form. So a lot to handle there with the statistics with overdoses, and the trends, show the numbers and the graph continually rising, through the future. Next slide. So when it comes to the cost of cleanup, it varies from site to site. All right. The costs that we're going to talk about are nominal, and they are associated with more of a worst case scenario, let's just say of actual illness, accident, death, or the probability of litigation. So we start out with the initial site assessment, which, for example, in the state of California is required to have a CIH perform this assessment. It can range anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000. That usually includes a site assessment. It requires a generation of a sampling strategy for the potentially contaminated surfaces so that we can get an idea on where the areas are more contaminated versus less contaminated. We'll investigate how potentially they were processing the illicitly manufactured drugs, and we'll interpret the data to come up with a remedial work plan. So that's next with the site remediation. That's usually to the contractors. We will generate a very detailed site plan on how to clean, when to clean, what order to clean, different type of best management practices to use along the way. And the contractor will take that. And as you can see here, site remediation use area usually is anywhere up to $20,000. Well, that will include decontamination, removal of building materials, and all associated contractor fees. So once we've drummed up that plan and we've given it to the contractor and they've performed the decontamination according to our plan, we'll come back and we'll make sure that the residence or the occupancy area is safe for reoccupancy. We'll do a post-remediation assessment, and we'll pretty much mirror what we did in the initial assessment, and we'll verify that the remediation was completed and it was successful, and that the area is safe for occupants going forward in the future. So looking at a little bit more of the health and safety code here in California, which outlines specific requirements, steps to take when performing both a preliminary site assessment work plan, which we shorten to PSA, and also a PSA report. Both of these, both the plan and the report usually runs upwards of about $5,000. Within the plan, we give a summary of the information and interviews. We give a summary of all the investigative clues that we found, areas of concern, protocols, analytical methods, everything to show that the sample procedure was done accordingly and to procedure. And also within the PSA report, which again could be up to $5,000, there's similar information as far as sampling strategy, remediation recommendations, and plans for the post-remediation site assessment. State to state, these laws vary. Here in California, it's required when a methamphetamine or fentanyl lab has been deemed or defined for that area. So it's actually a requirement in the state of California, and other states have their set requirements as well, which we meet from a professional and technical standpoint. Lab use areas typically require much more extensive remediation due to numerous chemicals and reactions that occur. And what we're learning is that a lot of times just the removal of building materials is the best option, just due to the probability that they might not clean up the areas sufficiently and might have to come back and retest. And we've been in situations where, we've been back 2 or 3 times to verify cleaning. And, that just continually runs the bill up. Whereas if we would have just disposed of those materials in the first place and just replaced them, we believe that, the cost associated would have been a little bit less. So this is why it's important to have a CIH come in, because we're able to help determine the extent of contamination and help put together a very precise plan on how to remediate and abate these hazards and make sure that your risk going forward is as minimal as possible.
Thanks, Roosevelt. So we have a little case example of a project we did recently where everything we've kind of talked about so far is put into play. So up in the Bay Area, we received a call from a client, property manager, letting us know that they had concerns about chemicals in an apartment unit. The brief background is that a troubled tenant was throwing acid at people and spraying fire extinguisher residue at individuals. So crazy call right off the jump. We didn't know what to expect, but we went in the right PPE. We brought in someone to assess conditions before anything. And while we were taking a look at the apartment unit, we picked up the clues and the cues of a meth lab. We saw a couple of containers of acid, little burnt areas and things like that. And we kind of put all the pieces together and we let the client know, hey, we think you have meth activity, a meth lab activity on your hands. Now, the client was a little bit reluctant at first, saying, well, how do you know? The police didn't say anything about it. And I should also note that the police came in, did an investigation report. They found no signs of a meth lab. Now, when we came in, we urged the client, we said, we strongly believe it's a meth lab. And after some persuasion, we let them know to treat it as a meth lab because there's regulatory requirements. And not just that, if you don't find there's meth and fent and you just go ahead and remediate, and that new family moves in later on and gets exposed to meth and fent that you never investigated, what happens then? Right? The example of the baby crawling on the ground, a new family being exposed, regulatory fines, fees, a big impact on your reputation as if you're a big name out there. So thankfully, the client listened to us, treated it as a meth lab, and then sure enough, about a month later, the letter came in from another agency, the Department of Health, that investigated and found it to be a meth lab. So by us coming in and doing that assessment up front, we caught it early and the project was done correctly, safely, and liability was reduced, health and safety of utmost importance was protected. So that's just one example of many why it's so important to bring in a professional. If you see any of the signs we talked about in the previous slides, bring in someone to double check that for you, to give you that clearance that yes, you have a problem, or no, you're good to continue with whatever you're doing. So to kind of throw it all together, proper site characterization or remediation is the key for risk management. As Roosevelt showed us with the trends, every year this trend is exploding. It's something we need to address now, and if we don't, it's going to come to us regardless. So for risk management, if there's any signs of a meth lab or drug use or anything like that, it's very prudent to be on top of it and investigate it before the matter. So Roosevelt, can you touch on some of our other services?
Yes. So just to piggyback on top of what Patrick said, in his case study, for example, we had not only the issue of methamphetamine and fentanyl, but as he mentioned, there was tear gas that was deployed into the unit, and there was also a fire extinguisher that was actually deployed as well. So we had the tear gas to actually worry about, and we actually had phosphates, from the corrosiveness of the fire extinguisher as well. So ATEC is a full-service, one-stop shop environmental health and safety firm. We are broken down into four specific divisions. We have environmental engineering, we have industrial hygiene, occupational safety, and what we call building sciences. So we specialize in written programs, auditing, training, sampling, monitoring, and permitting. Within that umbrella, we do a host of industrial hygiene services, including hazard assessments, control recommendations, air quality assessments, occupational exposure risk assessments for people at work, for example, noise monitoring and compliance, construction safety, oversight and monitoring, toxic environments and forensic sampling testing, indoor environmental quality, which is also known as indoor air quality, We do extensive ventilation assessments and work through the design phase with a lot of organizations on that front. Kai and a couple other professionals here within the office hold professional ergonomist certification. So we specialize in ergonomic assessments, recommendations, and training. We work closely with the risk managers for risk assessments and reductions, litigation and support whenever there is a lawsuit involved, and accident prevention. We work heavily on the healthcare side of things with infection control, with infection prevention, monitoring, USP 797 and 800 monitoring. We do all viable bacterial and fungal monitoring, in addition to a host of hazardous substance and hazardous waste management consulting. So we do everything from your soil sampling, groundwater, contamination, remediation, air quality compliance, you name it. There's not too many services ATEC does not provide as a one-stop shop service. We have all the certified professionals that are niche for said projects. So you don't have to worry about us having to outsource our projects. We have professional engineers, certified safety professionals, certified industrial hygienists, everyone in-house to service your needs. We are primarily located on the West Coast, but we cover nationwide for all projects. So with that being said, I am going to open up the floor for an open discussion, question, answer. So I know there was a lot of information to digest here for the group, but we would love to answer any questions. Usually if one person has a question, someone else has it as well. So, you know, I want to open up the floor and try to clarify or, you know, put down any red flags that were raised, or, you know, clarify anything, or get you any more resources that you might need to make a educated decision or business decision in the future.
I'll start us off. I have a question. So kind of based off this, you guys had touched on, you guys did, you know, like a school playground and, you know, things like that. How quickly, once someone contacts you about their concern, are you guys able to get out to the site and make your evaluation?
We're usually there probably, it just depends on the location. You know, like we try to respond same day, but we can pretty much hang our hat and we will be there the very next business day.
Oh, that's great. That's really quick.
Mm-hmm.
And Brittany, I think you had a question. What do you think the reason behind the increase in 2015 is for overdoses? If based on what I've read and my bit of research, there's usually been a drug of choice in different periods of time. And I think with the introduction of fentanyl, and for those couple of reasons we mentioned, is like how cheap it is and how it can really amplify the effect of a product. And so what's happened is that people who've used methamphetamine for a long time and otherwise been okay are now being exposed to drugs cut with fentanyl, and you don't know the concentration of fentanyl, you don't know the grade of it, you don't know how it was manufactured. And that's the unfortunate situation, is that every time people are doing drugs these days, they're rolling the dice. You don't know how much fentanyl is in it. And then I should have elaborated on the picture more, but one lethal dose of fentanyl is 2 milligrams, which is like, if I had to paint a quick picture, like 5 grains of sand. And if you could show that picture, Alex, that'd be great. So if you see the penny on the bottom right, that tiny little amount, that residue right there is a lethal dose of fentanyl. And so when somebody's buying crystal methamphetamine or cocaine or whatever the drug is, a lot of times to save money, these manufacturers cut it in. And then that's how this is playing out, unfortunately. But great question.
And may I add to that there are other emerging illicitly manufactured drugs also, like there's one called carfentanil, which is even more potent than fentanyl. And then there's also another one that we're finding frequently laced with methamphetamine and fentanyl called xylazine. So these are also 2 emerging illicitly manufactured drugs that we are going to be on the lookout for, and that we're going to be sampling for when we run into these suspect situations.
Yeah, I may want to add something too. Now, this graph is about overdose. Now, the drug use may be who knows? We haven't got the actual drug use, but this is for overdose. So like Patrick touched on, because its potency is very high. So the phenomenon of overdose is related to, I would say, the quality control. Those guys who manufacturing this kind of a drug, they don't have much of a quality control. So that's why the overdose, remember the overdose is because of the loss of control of the potency, and a lot of time that's the problem.
I have one more question too. So then if a apartment has been deemed a lab of some sort, and then they've done the remediation work, is the landlord required to disclose that in the state of California? Or once they've done the remediation, there's no requirement for them to disclose that to a future tenant?
That's a good question. I don't know if they're required to disclose it per se, but there is a lot of record of it. So I would imagine it's probably gonna be out there if I had to guess. So for example, if the agency finds out that it's a meth lab, they call it a meth lab, right? Even if it's 2 little containers and a little bit of residue, that unit is now red tagged. They put up a sign, no entry, and you have to go through all those channels that Roosevelt was breaking down for us, a PSA work plan, a PSA report, and you have to make that plan, get it reviewed and approved by the agency, then they send it back, and it's a whole chain of events and records. So I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that, but I would imagine it could be public record.
Yes, and usually the agencies that he's referring to is usually going to be your local healthcare agency associated with hazardous contaminants. So, they'll have record because they have to actually approve our plan before it actually moves forward. So I'm sure there, will be a paper trail of the incident. But I'm not sure. We'd have to double check and see, like in the event that you want to sell your house, like a flood or something like that, or mold, would that actually be required for you to disclose that? We'd have to check.
I can definitely follow up on that. If I'm going off of memory, I remember a brief statement in one of the correspondence letters where they mentioned that future occupants may have to be informed of it. Don't quote me on it, but I think I recall reading that, but I can always clarify.
That's okay. I was just curious if you guys know off the top of your head. I imagine so. If not, I'm sure it's one of those little lines, in the bottom of something that you signed that it has everything listed.
That's a great question, though. That's stuff we have to think about with these projects. Tony has a question. With the increase in homelessness in major metro cities, are city governments taking action with remediating public and contaminated spaces? Not that I know of, to be honest. I feel like in public areas, especially, I visit Seattle a lot, and I'm seeing it very prevalent there in downtown areas, things like that. Now, if it's in a business or an apartment, it's easy for the health agency to come in and say, you're responsible, you as the landlord of said property. But public areas is, I haven't come across it yet, which kind of, I don't want to take any guesses, but makes you wonder, are they doing it? So I wish I had a better answer for you, Tony, but it's the Wild West right now.
And I'll add a little bit to that. I think that the awareness, as we saw from the graphs, this thing is so new that everybody's just now really catching up with the spike, in the epidemic. So to give you an example, we don't have any examples of the government or taking actions, but we do a lot of work with law enforcement, for example, to test and make sure that the back of the squad cars, the impounding station where they first bring you in, those type of areas, you would never think, but, inside of casinos, just areas you would just never think, so the awareness is there. But as far as a major push, there hasn't been anything from a governmental standpoint. They're just, taking the cases as they come. However, from the law enforcement side, they are taking a few extra steps, and we're assisting with that as well.
So Jay has a question as well. Are there any follow-up testing requirements after the initial test? We always recommend it. If there's a use area where someone's smoking, Usually you would want to do an initial test to characterize where and how much the drugs are. And then once it's been remediated, you do a follow-up assessment and resample to validate that it's been remediated effectively to below regulatory limits. In California, there's specific limits as to how much can be on a surface, and that it's now safe for occupancy. You don't want to remediate and not do follow-up assessment, because then you have no data, you have no proof or confirmation that the job is done. So if the remediation contract says job is done and you take his word for it and someone gets sick, you have nothing on your end to defend yourself in your efforts to make it occupiable.
Yeah.
And what we're also learning that is there's also cross-contamination of adjacent units and common areas that have to be taken into consideration as well. So there's often times where there's a shared HVAC system within let's say a complex or a hotel. So we have to now worry about adjacent units, maybe units above, and also in common areas we've commonly sampled out in hallways, lobby areas, elevators, all these areas where potentially cross-contamination could have occurred from the source.
I have one more follow-up question then. What do you guys do to like protect yourselves then when you're just in like a general public area that you think like, oh, hey, this might be like a high risk area for some usage to have been here? Is there anything that you guys do just preventively other than, you know, not like going into a lab, but just so that everyone has like an idea of safety?
Patrick, you want to take that or you want me to take it?
Yeah, I can take it. So we have internal protocols and procedures to protect our employees. So anytime someone is describing the case and it sounds like drug use or something like that, we recommend the proper PPE, the protocols, you know, pre-ventilate the space, collect information as much as you can before you enter the space. We have Narcan on hand, which is kind of like it reverses the effects of an overdose should an employee get exposed. And oftentimes we utilize the buddy system where we have one employee enter the space to investigate and the other one just outside in the event of emergency. So there's a lot of things we can do. And the same way we recommend this for our staff, we recommend it to contractors who are doing the work to keep them safe, or the property manager if they really want to get involved, things like that. So there's a lot of things in place that we do to control, because it's such a high hazard industry right now. And we don't want to take any chances.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. Does anybody here have any experience with a claim involving methamphetamine, fentanyl, or any drugs? I'm curious if you guys have had a case like that.
Yeah, THC, cocaine, heroin. We've ran into it all.
I've definitely had some work comp claims with employees being under the influence of different substances.
Hi, this is Niles Espinoza. I do have some claims, but they're apartment owners, so they were accused of being held, you know, liable for not having security, and then there was crimes committed on premises because someone entered, you know, that was really high, or an apartment unit tenant's guest was high, and they, you know, but nothing from a first party remediation. But then again, these are other states too, where, you know, the laws are different, and you know, certain remediation requirements aren't as needed per se.
That's a great point. And sometimes if you want to, a lot of times, like we get calls, for example, a vacant home has been broken into by an individual and they start smoking in it. Then that kind of raises the red flag that now there's residues and vapors and everything's condensed on those surfaces. So that might be kind of a question mark you'd want to stomp out should you receive another call like that. And yeah, it totally varies in terms of the level of risk people are comfortable taking and the, you know, municipal regulations in said areas. So a lot of factors at play there.
And I just want to make the comment that dealing with a consultant like ATEC, we ensure that the work plan gets approved the first time. So what we've learned too is that there's a lot of time wasted when the work plan isn't sufficient and doesn't get approved, and there's continual drafts that have to happen. So, you know, that's a lot of lag time, you know, in the process. So we ensure that, you know, there's a first pass success, you know, in our submission and approval. And we've actually been endorsed, by some local healthcare agencies for the great work that we do when we generate our preliminary site assessments. So we have great references.
Well, if there are no other questions, we'll let you guys get on with your day, but we really appreciate you coming and presenting. This was a fantastic presentation, and I think everyone here gained a lot of information, and we really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day.
Absolutely. And if you guys have any questions later on or just want a quick chat or second opinion, our contact information is on the slide. We'd love to hear from you. It doesn't have to be a big project. If you just want to have a quick question, please reach out to us. I'll talk your ear off. I'd love to share what we have. So please do.
Thank you. And any attendees, if you'd like a copy of this recording, please feel free to email the LACPCU email and we'll get it over to you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.